Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot, and in today's video let's have a look into the performance calculator that we've just been given with the electronic flight bag in the Asobos Boeing 787. Now before we can start using it, we actually need to initialize a little bit of the flight's data, so let's quickly start with that as a prerequisite. So first of all, let's start with the Payload. So going to the weight and balance menu here, set from OFP, so let's get that stuff. And here we go. Interesting to see, by the way, that I got a couple more seats in my plane and sim brief than I have in the virtual one, but apparently that works. Okay, anyway, going back from here, let's go right into the route request, because we do want our route to be in the box before we can use the performance calculator. So setting your weight and setting your route is like the minimum that you should do before starting your takeoff performance calculation. Obviously that includes selecting the runway that you want to use, so in our case 25 center with an Oboka 2 Mike departure, for example, does sound reasonable. And with all of that filled in, we can now move ahead to our takeoff performance calculator, which is what ultimately this video is about. We're going to start by initializing the flight. Now, not that this would do anything in the sim at the moment, at least nothing notable, but in real life we would go for that. So for that reason, just make it a good habit to start pressing that. From here on, we'll move over to the performance, and you can see that there are a couple of fields over here that it automatically has filled out. That includes our departure airport and the departure runway. And it's also filled the QNH, which it has taken straight from the PFD, so that's something to be aware of a little bit later on. And the takeoff weight from the performance init page. So this stuff down here, you can manually enter if you want to. That is what you would normally do in real life, unless you uplink some stuff into the EFB. But the stuff up here you cannot enter manually. For that reason we have to enter the departure airport and the departure runway. Well, actually the runway we can enter, but the departure airport at least. As you can see, we cannot change this. Okay. So, unfortunately, intersections are not simulated, so we gotta live without them for the time being. Now, I don't know how many changes are going to come for this with future updates, but eventually, should they ever enable the no temp button, in there you could use a temporary shortening of the runway in order to simulate an intersection departure. However, that is something for the future, as that is currently not simulated. So what we can do, however, we can go into the FMS and either fill out our weights, like so. We can go init, perf init, put in the zero fuel weight, and that should give us some gross weight information in here as well if we just copy those FMC data again, as you can see. Or you could just type that stuff manually. Now, if you were to type that stuff manually, you are going to notice something. In here it says takeoff weight 253,603, and that is exactly our current gross weight. So you would need to subtract your taxi fuel from that. Otherwise you are simply going to have a slightly higher takeoff weight, which is not all too much of a problem. Okay, so going on from here, we need to make a couple selections. You can see on the condition over here there is a lot more than just dry and wet. Now that is just like in real life. You've got a lot of different possibilities here, like standing water, slush, compacted snow, dry snow, ice, and then just braking action, good, medium, or poor. Now, if you are using your default flight simulator weather, there is not too much information you can get about that. But if you are, for example, flying in VATSIM, then usually there would be something in the ATIS about any of the stuff down here, if there is anything the likes published. Now, if you're flying in the US and you're able to pull the real-world ATIS, simply Google it. You will find it pretty quickly. Then you can get some more complete information on that for the airport where you currently are. Now let's have a very quick look into the weather data that we currently have. So let's go on the live weather meta and let's get the data for Frankfurt that we currently have down here. You can see it's currently a wind of 2806, slightly variable, CAF 20 degrees, QNH 1027. Now that does let us assume that the runway is dry. In the simulator, unless it is actively raining, it's usually dry anyway. Okay then, let's go ahead with how to fill out the following fields. If we start with the wind, then you might be eager to take simply the main wind that you see over here, the 280 at 6. However, that is not what we want to do. Now, think about it. This is the average wind. However, in the case of our actual takeoff, the wind may be a little bit worse than the average. So, if there's a variable wind given down here, then we always want to take the least favorable wind. So that means we want to take the least headwind or the strongest tailwind, depending on what is applicable. Now, here's what we can do. In our case, we've got a runway 25, so if we take this wind from 360 over here, that means we'll actually have a slight tailwind. So if we simply go for 360 at 6 knots, that is going to provide us the most conservative wind input. And as you can see down there, it says 2 knots tailwind, 6 knots crosswind. So that is also a very good opportunity to determine your tail and crosswinds, as those may be limiting for your flights. Keep in mind, normally 10 knots is the tailwind limit, however that can be extended by the operator to 15 knots if a performance evaluation has been conducted for the runway in question. So for you it basically means you can use 15 knots tailwind as long as you still get positive results down here. Okay, then going on, obviously temperature, we simply take what's in the META, and the same goes for the QNH. Again, be careful with that one down here, it does take it straight from the PFD, so if we want to use the actual numbers, we can simply type that in. And what's pretty useful as well is that down here it does tell us the QNH in inches as well. Now, 30.33 is what it is, so if we enter something like this, oh, that looks like there is a little bug in there. Let's make it 30.33. You can see if you enter it in inches, then it gives you the hectopascals down here as well. Likewise, you should be able, for example, if you enter 68 Fahrenheit. Okay, that one it doesn't want to take, so this is centigrade only. That's a couple of possibilities of the stuff you can do with a real-world unit. What you can do as well for the wind, currently you can see we've taken the most conservative, which is what you should do. But let's assume that our winds were showing variable 5 knots. So instead of this over here, it would simply say variable 5 knots. Then obviously we want to take the most conservative approach, and that would be 5 knots tailwind. Now, you don't need to do any calculation in order to get your tailwind, but simply go in here, type -5, and you can see it's taking a 5 knot tailwind straight away. So that makes your life a little bit easier there, and there's a little trick for the onboard performance tool to make it more usable. Okay, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to re-enter the wind data that we already had. So with our weather data filled out, we now have to choose for the thrust rating. And we can make it pretty easy and start with the optimum rating, leave the assumed temperature here at maximum, and then also take the optimum flaps. Anti-ice, well, as needed. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that in a few moments. Let's just take it off for now. And the improved climb is unfortunately not simulated. You can see that now the calculate button comes up, and if we hit this, it's running through calculation, and here we go. Now, let us quickly talk about the anti-ice just before we continue with how to interpret the data we are being given below. So, anti-ice, when do you need it and what do you need? So, as you can see in here, we've just got engine or engine auto. We don't even have an option for wing anti-ice in here. Now, when is engine anti-ice needed? Well, that's quite easy. You have to have a temperature of plus 10 degrees centigrade or less, and visible moisture needs to be present. So, plus 10 degrees centigrade or less, quite logic. Visible moisture, what does that mean? Well, basically it means any sort of precipitation, like rain, snow, but also a dense fog, for example. So, fog of 1 statute mile or less, that is 1.6 kilometers, also counts as visible moisture. So that is kind of your criteria for anti-ice usage. Also, when you're entering that number, then be sure to take things a little bit careful, because it does not only concern what you have right on the ground. Let's say, for example, you're taking off with a temperature of plus 1 degree, and you've got an overcast in 400 feet, however the runway is dry. Well, you might still want to calculate with the engine anti-ice on, and actually use that engine anti-ice, of course, on your takeoff, because you will be using that anti-ice prior to the acceleration altitude. Now, basically what you want to take into consideration here is that you have to turn the anti-ice on shortly after takeoff. Since we're always thinking about the worst possible scenario, obviously we're thinking about an engine failure at V1, and then with that engine failure right at V1, we still want to be able to get our plane out safely. So for that reason, we need to take into account something like, might we need the anti-ice a little bit later. The latest point that we need to consider here is our acceleration height, because from that point onwards, our performance calculation doesn't really matter that much anymore. That is obviously except for the two-engine performance, you name it. Okay then, when we have calculated our takeoff performance, this is basically what we get. And we've got two buttons over here. We've got the ATM, which stands for Assumed Temperature Method, and that is kinda what the Airbus equivalent would be in terms of flex temperature. Now, flex temperature is a term that flight simmers are usually a little bit more acquainted to. For that reason, just imagine flex temperature to be the same as ATM. The other button we have over here is full. Now, there is something that's a little bit strange in this calculator over here. In any Boeing OPT that I've used so far, changing between ATM and full is going to change between either using that selected temperature here, or not using it, but keeping the fixed D-rate. So you can see over here we've got D-rated takeoff 1, but if we press full, it goes to full toga. Now, that is not how it would behave in any Boeing OPT that I've worked with. Then again, I haven't flown the 787, so if that is how it works on the actual plane, then I didn't say anything. In any case, let's quickly talk about a couple of limitations that you have with your performance figures. So you can see right now that it does calculate an ATM for us. It might also say that ATM is not allowed and only full thrust is available, depending on the circumstances of your takeoff data calculation. Now, there are a couple of rules imposed by airlines, however, to reduce certain risks. For example, my old airline had a limitation not to use ATM whenever the crosswind was 10 knots or greater. Now, with that I'm talking direct crosswind, so the X-wind component you see down here. And keep in mind, if you had a variable wind, that you may have a little bit more crosswind than what is shown over here on the most conservative calculation. Now, let's say once we decided for a certain setting to use, then we can send that output to the airplane. And now it's going to tell us right over here that takeoff data has been sent. So if we quickly go over here, we can accept it, and you can see that it automatically filled all that stuff. Also note the thrust limit page, which is something that you still need to check. So over here you've got the same settings that the airplane has used up here. So you've got the D takeoff 1 and 21 degrees assumed temperature. As you can see, that's takeoff 1 and that's 21 degrees. And now we cross-check the TPR that the computer has calculated against what is in our box. So we've got 79.7 in here, and that means we also want to see 79.7 in here. Now, I'm not 100% sure about the Boeing 787. On the 737, the value could change slightly by between 0.6 and 0.8, depending on if the air conditioning has been turned on. However, since air conditioning isn't provided by the engines in the 787, I'm not sure if a limitation like that applies. Otherwise, the takeoff value needs to be within 0.2 of your actual TPR in the flight management computer as well. Alright, that is basically how you calculate your takeoff data, and a couple of considerations that you can use in order to get the most out of your takeoff calculator. Now, a couple of words over here. The acceleration height that you get calculated on here is simply taken from your FMC. Obviously, in the real one that wouldn't be the case. In here it is. So if you change this one, let's say we put 1000 in here, and then we go into here and just hit that calculate button again. Or let's make it copy FMC data and hit calculate. Then you can see it changes the acceleration height in here. So that number is, well, not... It's quite meaningless in the simulation because it simply copies the FMC, which has its default value of 1500 in there. Apart from that, the center of gravity would also play a role. So let's say, for example, that we've got a CG of 35, we hit calculate, then it should calculate the trim setting for us. However, this one doesn't. I do hope that that's something that they are going to add with a future update. Well, in the meantime, that is pretty much it. So I would like to thank you very much for watching. Maybe one last quick tip over here. With the latest update, if you click the wind button in here, then you can, just like with the outside air temperature, automatically fill those now. The real airplane can't do that. However, if you don't know the wind data that you need to enter over here and you have no means of getting present meta, then you can always just use this little shortcut from the FMS, which is going to pre-fill that data. Just be aware that the wind entered is the present wind at the very second where you press the button over here, so that means that if you've got a variable wind, that's not taken into account. Like you can see over here, it's 287 at 6 now. As we remember, it was variable between 200 and 360, so this is not necessarily the best possible case. However, it is one possible case how you could do things. Alright, that's going to be it for this video. I'd like to thank you very much for watching. Do hope that you enjoyed this one and learned something on it. I hope to see you all again on the next one. In the meantime, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe, as it does really help out the channel. And if you really love what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all again on the next one.